You know what's great about some epic fantasy trilogies? They come in 4 books. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about Osten, and in this case we'll be talking about 2 Green Angel Tower Part 1. This is Part 1 of the 3rd book, or in this case, well, it's the 3rd book of the trilogy. We will be talking about 2 Green Angel Tower Part 2 later on of the trilogy that is called Memory, Sorrow, Thorn. God, that was a terrible sentence. I'm sorry for it. So once again, the 3rd book in a 4-book trilogy called Memory, Sorrow, Thorn by Tad Williams that came out in the late 80s, early 90s, and we'll be moving on to the newer books in the near future. But today we'll be talking about To Green Angel Tower. I have videos on the Dragonbone Chair and Stone of Farewell somewhere on this channel. I'll try to link them down below, and yeah, we'll be doing the usual thing. I'll give you a quick synopsis, although, you know, this is the 3rd book in a series, so I expect this one will be short, because, you know, why do you want that for an ongoing series? And then we'll be talking about themes and bits and pieces in this book that I think are important, and make, well, the old Osten books such staples in epic fantasy and such important books in the general history of that genre. And then we'll all go on and, you know, do something else with our lives for a while. Alright, so what's happening in To Green Angel Tower Part 1? Well, a lot, and yet not that much. See, at the end of Stone of Farewell, everyone basically ended up on the Stone of Farewell. And by everyone, I mean Simon, and Binabik, and what's his name, Prince Joshua, and all of these people. Other people were still all over the place, but that's sort of where our main characters are, except, of course, for Princess Miriamel, who is hanging out somewhere in the sea for reasons, and we'll be talking a bit more about her today. So what happens this time around is, well, Miriamel and Tiamek, the scholar from the Ran, and Isgrimnor are making their way to the Stone of Farewell, whereas the rest of the gang is trying to desperately fight off people sent by the King Elias to to survive on that rock, and then move on from there to do other things. That's already a lot, right? So that's kind of what we get here. The start of the fight back is basically what happens in this book, because it's supposed to be a trilogy, and at some point you can't keep running anymore. You need to actually go and fight that evil king, and so we'll be talking about that today, and I'll go into details from now on, so pre-prepared. And the first thing here I want to talk about is the feeling of slowing down. Now, this is something that a lot of epic fantasy series struggle with. You can definitely look and point at, say, The Wheel of Time, but there's a lot of these where you start out with a relatively slim first story, or relatively brisk first novel, and the further you go, the slower things are. See, when you look at the Dragonbone Chair, it basically covers 2-3 years, 2.5 years or something like that in time, with, you know, King John dying, Elias taking over, Joshua fleeing, the siege of Naglimund, the fall of Naglimund. We have the whole quest to find the sword. That's a long time. That's basically 2 years of time, 1.5 years maybe of time happening there. Whereas the Stone of Farewell covers a couple of months, probably half a year, something like that. To Green Angel Tower, without, you know, having looked it up, maybe 2 months, maybe. So while the books are not getting shorter, they cover less and less time, and that's something that I think we need to talk about, because there's something happening with epic fantasy that we don't see in, and that's why we need to go back and talk about Tolkien again for a bit. We don't see that in Lord of the Rings. See, Lord of the Rings basically covers 1 year, I think. That's sort of the point. Like, Tolkien likes to tell stories that take 1 year, basically. Although I'm always a bit confused about Lord of the Rings taking that long. I thought it was like 2 years, but, you know, basically the same amount of stuff happens in each book when you look at times. There's, you know, battles, people moving around in book 3. it's already a bit more condensed in book 3, the time, than in book 2 and book 1, but it's still sort of okay. And I think partly the problem there is, of course, lies in the medium of storytelling. We tell a story. We do setup. For setup, we introduce all the players, we introduce the problem, we introduce all of these things in a tale. And then we come to the resolution. And the closer we get to the resolution, the more we need to explain why everyone ends up where they end up for the big showdown, and so on, which is definitely something that's just happens because the focus is so heavily on plot resolution. We go into more details. We don't need to talk about every single tree that Simon walks past on his way to the mountain where he finds the sword. We don't need to do that. But maybe we need to talk about more detail when there is the final battle. Maybe we want that in more detail, sort of. Just to make clear that this is the bit that is really important. We create emphasis or importance or the semblance of importance by adding more detail. And that's certainly something we have in every single story when you look at it. It just feels incredibly, it comes across incredibly strong in these books. I've always talked about the fact that I think Ted Williams is great at building worlds and setting up stories and really bad at ending them. It's certainly something I found in his sci-fi, cyberpunk, whatever you want to call it, series, Otherland as well. And there's a reason why he starts out telling people that it's going to be a trilogy and then it turns out to be 4 books. And it usually ends up being there. I mean, look at George R. R. Martin, right? He didn't set out to write 7 books. He thought that Feast for Crows and Dance with Dragons would be 1 book. There is something happening in epic fantasy, in fantasy in general, and in a lot of ongoing books that we tend to have a more complex story at the end than we started out with. There's a terminology called feature creep, which you get usually, game design and stuff like that. But I feel something similar happens with storytelling, or at least modern storytelling a lot of the times. We start out with a simple world and a simple story, and throughout that story, a lot of authors start adding bits. And we see that especially well with this book, the whole Memories of Thorn trilogy. See, at the beginning, our main and almost exclusive viewpoint character is Simon in the first parts of the story. Everything we see happens, through Simon's eyes. That works because most of the events happening at that time are set in the castle, in the Hayhold, and Simon's hanging around there. And Ted Williams has cleverly set him up as a bit of a, dreamy, wandering, servant boy, scullion boy who has enough time, or at least, he gets into trouble for not performing his jobs, but he spends all that time wandering around the castle and seeing stuff. He overhears the brothers, Joshua and Elias, fighting. He sees all these bits and pieces. He sees, Pirates, he sees all these people doing all the stuff, so we see everything through Simon. But once he has to flee the place, right? Once he goes away from the castle, Ted Williams basically has 2 choices. One choice is to just leave everything that happens in the castle out of the story, just focus on Simon's story. Obviously, he's gets reunited with Miriamel on the trip there, and he can do that, or he can keep adding new perspectives. And some of these are just quick glances, an intro to a chapter, like the first couple of paragraphs are about, some people running around in the castle. You suddenly have, Earl Gothwolf, who's a commander for Elias, added as a character, who just is, at the beginning, he's just there to give us, an update on what's going on with the enemies. Now, this is interesting because this is something, the need to give us a perspective on the bad guys is something that Ted Williams introduces in a way that, we don't find in we don't find that in Terry Brooks. We don't find it in, at least not in the first one, in sort of Shannara, but we definitely also don't find it in Tolkien. Lord of the Rings does not give us anything of that sort. The only time we find out something happening with bad guys is when Gandalf is confronting Saruman in the tower, and that's a flashback that Gandalf tells us. We don't know what's going on in, in Barad-dûr. We never get there. However, with the need to make these stories feel more realistic, And we have, obviously, motives for some of our bad guys. Elias' motive, being the grief for his dead wife, for example, being a key point here. And we need to show that at some point. And Simon is not enough perspective for that. So Ted Williams adds these external perspectives, and at some point they are just quick windows, quick glimpses, flashes, so to speak, of what's going on in other places. And then the next step is when the narrative splits up and so forth, which is something that we see with Lord of the Rings as well, when, in book 2, we suddenly have 3 or 4 parallel stuff. We have, Merry and Pippin running around with the orcs, we have Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli following them, and then later on we obviously have the story of Sam and Frodo going to Mordor, and we suddenly have more than one narrative, trading chapters with Tolkien. But it's still fairly limited, and they're still the original characters. There's not new perspectives added to Lord of the Rings. However, with these flashes to give us the motives of the bad guys, because in a non-mythic story, you need to have motivations because that's like the conventions we've come to understand from, more come to rely on from a more contemporary literary form of storytelling. We need these motivations, so we need perspectives to have them in there. And that's something that then leads to giving these characters more and more time on the screen, right? At the beginning, Earl Gothwolf is just a perspective to see what's going on with Elias and Priorities and the sword, but then he kind of becomes his own character. He has his own motivations and stuff like that, which leads to that whole Earl Gothwolf plotline happening in Stone of Farewell and to Green Angel Tower, which goes all over the place now. And suddenly we have, a couple 100 pages just dedicated to that plotline that originally was just to show us that, Priorities is a bastard and Elias is sort of grieving and maybe not the main bad guy here. And there's a bunch more of these bits and pieces, right? We have that scene with Megwyn at King Luth's court in Harnestia in the first book, which is mostly just there to show that, well, Gothwolf or Fingbolt or whichever guy it was at that point is a bastard and tries to get more money out of the Hernestiri, more tribute and more taxes. But then she becomes her own character, and we get a long plot line about just her development. And that's what I mean by feature creep. In this case, it's probably like character creep. We see the same thing with, say, A Song of Ice and Fire, where suddenly we have all these additional characters, which are just there to give us new, glimpses from what's happening all over the world. Because obviously the world is happening while there is our story going on. And then they are all woven into the story. And I get it. It's obviously tempting to do that as a writer, right? It feels good if you can connect everything. But it also means that once you've reached the end of your main plot line or whatever, you suddenly have way more stuff that you need to kind of fit in there. And that's very much what we see with Stone of Farewell. And then compared, or for example, now to Green Angel Tower Part 1, because the main set piece of this story is the battle for the Stone of Farewell, for Seswadra, and where the entire, several weeks of, or at least numerous days, siege of Naglimund in Dragonbone Chair is barely one chapter, much less, including the flight and everything, right? Suddenly there's the preparations for the battle, the actual battle. These things take up a large quantity of this book, which adds to that feeling of things slowing down. Because yes, this is just the main set piece of this entire book, and I think it's partly because adding more detail helps, partly having all these different characters that have developed or were developed over time with their own motives, perspectives, and so forth. They all need to be shown doing something in this story. Suddenly, the battle takes much longer. Add to that, obviously, a lot of detail that is happening in the descriptions of violence, as we spoke about before, and suddenly this takes up a lot of time. Similar bits are obviously the story that we need to talk about with Tiamek and Princess Miriamel and Kadrak, or whatever you want to call him, and in Isgrimnor going through the Ran, through the swamp. And here I need to mention something, because With Tiamat, we see that Ted Williams is able to talk about racism. Like to actually show it, because obviously the Rana man, while being described in a somewhat insensitive way when it comes to their gods, which are, very clearly inspired by Caribbean, I don't want to, voodoo related beliefs. And you can call that kind of culturally insensitive or whatever, but there is an awareness that everyone else, the white people in the actual cities, look down on these people. There is a portrayal of racism that works. So we know Ted Williams is aware of it, which makes it so interesting when you compare that portrayal of the Rana man, which is still, as I said, somewhat culturally insensitive, when you compare it to the portrayal of the trolls, which is something we'll come back to later, because there's an interesting thing that is general for a lot of fantasy. They are very human-centric in a weird way, is my point here. However, so what happens there is that long plot line is about those four leaving town, fleeing through the swamp, through Tiamat's home, and going all the way to the Stone of Farewell, where they end up. And that plotline takes a long time. Yes, there are some character developments there. There is some stuff that is established in that plotline. But do we actually need the whole battle scene in the Gant nest, my point here? Probably not in that detail, because there's not that much added, but the temptation is there, because it showcases these characters that were originally just, additional perspectives on the main plot, but now they are much more, and now they are used to establish, well, basically the fact that, some swamp creatures are sort of also controlled by the Storm King, just like the diggers, the Buchan, are controlled by the dark, the forces of darkness or evil, just like the giants are controlled by them. So we have that sort of thing going on, but it's not necessarily adding anything new. But it takes up a lot of time in this story. So my main point here was to, show how this feature creep leads to the fact that these fantasy stories are often feel like slowing down near the end of the actual, trilogy, quartet, or whatever you want to call it. And I find it interesting just, how Ted Williams is able to portray, prejudice, cultural prejudice and racism and so forth with the Rana man, and apparently is still, somewhat culturally insensitive. And I think that's once again part of the, of the times. This is like the 1980s. We've realized racism is bad. Looking down on people with different skin color is bad. But we've not yet realized that, taking interesting bits of what we find interesting of their culture and stealing that and using it for something else and maybe making fun of it is also bad, because racism is not just, beating up people. There's more to it, is apparently, is the point here. I also want to add that the fact that Tiamat is also, an outsider within his culture is somewhat problematic, because he's the only good guy there, sort of, because he's smart and he's educated, and he tried to bring his, make his way out of his actual culture into the Western culture, so to speak. There are some questions raised here. I'm not sure, I think it's as good as we can expect from something written in the late 1980s. I just want to, mention that it is there, and there is sort of this idea that the rest of the people there are at least not appreciative of his abilities to do stuff and kind of look down on him. There's, I don't know, it sometimes feels a bit weird, because we only get his perspective. We don't get anyone else's perspective. So the culture feels a bit, pushed to the side, marginalized, so to speak. But there's obviously more to talk about. And that is Megwin. As I already mentioned to her, in book one, she's just a perspective, so we see how her father is treated badly, and then how the whole Hernisteria are taken over by the North, by the pseudo-Vikings, the Rimmeritsgarders, and so forth. And then her plotline becomes more and more convoluted, because she becomes more and more of an actor. And I appreciate that on the one hand, because she's a female character. I think the way she's described is problematic. I already talked about the fact that while she's strong and smart and, capable and all of these wonderful things, she also thinks of herself as being, well, not conventionally attractive. And it's something that is brought up again and again, as if attractiveness is like the only thing open for women. So what I think is interesting here is that we basically get an Eowyn storyline. Now, Eowyn is one of the most interesting and unfortunately not ending well storylines in characters in Lord of the Rings, right? Her, will wish to become a soldier, to become a sword maiden, as she's called there. All of that stuff is really interesting. Tolkien going like, well, maybe sometimes women want to fulfill other stuff than just the very specific female role. It unfortunately does end with her, getting married and happy in a way that could have been handled better. Now, the interesting thing here is that Maegwyn follows a similar line. I mean, even their names are somewhat similar, right? She takes over, she rules the country or rules her people because her father's wife is incapable. She's obviously, a bit childish. She's portrayed in all kinds of negative ways. She's obviously good looking, but she's very much not capable of ruling places, which, I don't know, man. Do we have to go the not like other girls route there? But I guess, once again, it's the 1980s. Things are painted with a very broad brush. However, the point I'm trying to make here is that when Eowyn goes through her crisis of faith, she does her heroic deed, she kills the Lord of the Nazgul, and then she falls into that stupor, that darkness that is far more than just, her being touched by the Black Breath there, but it's also very much, that general crisis of faith and love and so forth. Maegwyn has the same thing, right? She wants to be loved by Count Eoler? Eoler, I think is his name, the guy. She wants to be loved by him, and he kind of wants to love her, but they're obviously not capable and so forth. And what happens with her is then, well, she goes mad, to put it mildly. She has incredible delusions. She kind of sort of moves further and further into that kind of weird dream world, a more religious mania, so to speak. And I think this is something that comes with what I spoke about last time. Tad Williams is taking an ethereal, mythic story, like Lord of the Rings, and makes it a very earthly story. So obviously, he needs to frame this crisis of faith in a different language, and the language he chooses is the language of mental illness. And that doesn't work so well, I think, in a lot of ways, because it's like, yeah, so all this pressure, she can't be, the leader that she wants to be, she's awkward, she feels that she's not, good looking, which apparently, I don't know, man. I find that whole idea just really abhorrent for all kinds of reasons, but it leads to changing the language. The problem is, you can say a lot of stuff in a mythic frame that you cannot say when you're using, terms like mental health or going down that road and expressing something as mental illness, because mental illness is something we all struggle with. So there's a need for care there in a lot of ways, or sensibility there, where that is not necessarily in the way that something is framed in a mythic frame by Tolkien, which makes the Maegwyn storyline feel not good, at least to me. And we'll talk about the resolution next time, because she's obviously still very much wandering in her dream world at this point. But it's something that I found important to mention, that it kind of ties into, on the one hand, the shift from a mythic dimension to a more worldly dimension that comes with responsibilities that Ted Williams is maybe not able to fulfill, but it also comes, it's also, once again, a meditation on gender roles. And we'll come back to the gender roles in a bit. Don't worry. Because we also need to talk about Princess Miriamel. See, part of the Princess Miriamel storyline is, of course, the seduction by the parasite Earl. I keep Aspitis, Earl Aspitis, that's his name. So what's interesting about that one, I think, is, once again, it's a complex story. See, Miriam runs away. She ends up on this ship, and she maybe has a crush, starts a crush. It's kind of difficult. She ends up in bed with Earl Aspites. Afterwards, Earl Aspites turns out to be a massive dick, and so I was like, well, I know who you are. I've got you here on my ship. We'll get married. The interesting thing here that I find fascinating is Ted Williams is attempting something very, very complex, very difficult. And it will definitely show in, questions of guilt and so forth. What I find fascinating here is that it is made clear, or Ted Williams makes it very clear, that Miriam thinks that she gave consent at the beginning. She wants to get with Earl Aspites because he's good looking and so forth. That storyline and the way that is framed would no longer fly today, because the idea of a power imbalance. It's just something. I mean, the idea of consent is not something that people in the 80s talked about. Let's be fair here. But the idea that even though he may look good and maybe a nobleman and treats her better than Cadrak at the time, he still has her on his boat, on his ship in the middle of the sea. She can't get away, and she's afraid of him discovering who she really is. How much freedom does she actually have in that dynamic to, consent to anything? And I think, especially with her feeling guilty for having given in and so forth. We'll come back to that whole idea of virginity in a bit. I think the problem there is that in 1988 language for epic fantasy, the idea of power imbalance and consent is just not, the language is just not there, which leaves this storyline, or leaves a very, very bad taste in my mouth when I read this storyline, because this was very much from the beginning not a seduction. This was very much forcing her to his will by Aspites the entire time. And yes, she gets, to flee from there and wreak some revenge on him and so forth. That's all great. But that idea of guilt, I think, is a very important one that will come up when we talk about the last part of this story. But I think it's important to keep in mind that this wouldn't fly anymore, but we have moved a long way in the last 30 years. And I think it's important to point that out. And that brings us to some of the final bits and pieces here that I think are important. Earl Aspites, it's very clear, or it's made clear, works for Priorities, the bad guy, the evil guy, the really evil guy. And we also have, what's this, Earl Thingbolt, the one who was supposed to marry Miriamel, and he's the bad guy who attacks the Stone of Farewell. And there's some things in the depiction here that I think are problematic. Not problematic, but just bad, or haven't aged well. See, they are cliché villains, all of those. Priorities casually kicks a dog or puppy to death in the first book, so we know he's evil. Thingbolt is constantly, an asshole. He's drinking all the time. He has attractive slave women kneeling around him. It's made very clear he's a absolute cartoonish villain, and so is Aspites in a lot of ways. Yes, he's good looking, but he's also very much a cliche villain. I find this very interesting because it once again kind of boils down to that question of evil and how to portray it in fantasy. See, Tolkien's very easy about that because once again he has this mythic language that he can use. Then people don't need motivations. Ted Williams needs motivations for his characters, and we have motivations there. Elias has a very clear motivation. He wants to he's racked by grief, and he does terrible things in order to be able to contact or possibly resurrect or whatever his dead wife. That's a solid motivation right there. Priorities just wants knowledge. I mean, the question of, dangerous knowledge is a very complicated one. We're not going into it today. But that's still sort of a knowledge, sort of a motivation. Everyone else just wants power or wants to be a dick. Like, Thingbolt just wants to be a dick. Aspites kind of wants to be a dick. And I think it's kind of sad because these are the cartoonishly bad villains that we know from pulp stories. A lot of the bad guys Conan kills are usually mad wizards who want to have power and knowledge, and that's all that they do. And then they have hideous laughter and are doing all these crazy shit. And that's once again where I feel this book is sort of on the right track, but the moral and psychological complexities that we find in later fantasy, with George R. Martin, with Joe Abercrombie, with the Milan Book of the Fall, all kinds of later books, they're not yet fully developed at that point. So he falls back to these shorthands and has these kind of villains of that sort. And I think that's something that brings me to the last part here, which is human culture's lack of foundation. This may come as a bit of a surprise, but we have very explicit descriptions of the Scythi and the Norns and, well, the Norns somewhat, and of course the trolls. But when it comes to human society is very much done in the shorthand. It's, well, we have these people that basically roam, and the more you know as a reader, you know about Rome, the more you struggle with that, or the less you struggle with it. These guys are basically like Celts. And then depending on whether you think Ireland or Scotland, your image will kind of shift. But he does a lot of shorthand stuff there. And that kind of works on the broad strokes, but it kind of breaks down. It kind of breaks down once you have like that moral dimension. Why is virginity and purity so important? I don't know. It's just assumed that in this human society, all over this human society, for some reason, that is the case. We're just supposed to take that as read. Same for the church. There is a church, but that church is very, very empty. It's like if someone who's not a Catholic would imagine the Catholic Church in some way, and that's sort of what we get. It's Mother Church. They are, I don't know what. We'll talk more about the church in the last book, I'm sure. But I think that's something that I find interesting with world building. It's like people in that time spend a lot of time, in that era, spend a lot of time developing non-human cultures. But when it comes to humanity, they very much just assume something. And Ted Williams, being an American, a white American, assumes a lot of stuff from a very Western perspective in how the world works. And these things come through exactly here, which is, once again, when stuff like virginity is apparently important, or the church is in some way, full of some very few good men, but also a bunch of like weird sort of religious fanatics that are never fully explained. They're just sort of like comic relief, like poor Brother Hangfist in the first book, and that's something that I find interesting, that we're careful when, well, not careful, but we're putting details in when we're talking about non-humans. But when we're talking about humans, a lot of our own prejudice, or in this case, the writer's prejudice, show through. And that's sort of where I want to end this for today, because I think it kind of covers the same thing as the sort of cliche villainy of Aspites and Thingbold and some people like that, because assumptions are all there is. There's just the surface. There's nothing below that, and it's fascinating to me to see that in the human cultures. All right, so let's finish this. I enjoyed this book in a way. I find it interesting to see how it slows down in so many ways. I think there are some things that are just not handled well. Most of those are the result of where the genre is at the time. Some things I just, the Megwin storyline, I just don't really like the way this is handled. I already didn't like the thing it's modeled on. That will never change. But in all, this is still, the best sort of homage to Tolkien, or way of making Tolkien a more worldly, or the Tolkien model a more worldly model, and thus a precursor for stuff like Game of Thrones, or even the things that, Robin Hobb is writing. It's a necessary step here, and we see all the problems with that, but also all the good bits in this story, in this book. And I, for one, am very much looking forward to the last book, when we finally find out why there are angels, or green angels, or whatever. The last book, I'll be talking about it very soon. I hope you enjoyed this. Let me know what you think about To Green Angel Tower Part 1. Let me know what you think about all the problems I brought up. I don't know. Say something in the comments. I'll talk to you very soon. Until then, I don't know, like, subscribe, thank me, I don't know, join the Patreon if you feel like it, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks, and cheers.